thank you all for inviting me. Is the mic working okay? Yeah, okay. But especially the search committee chair, Ben Carrington, the leadership of both units, Stephen Holscher and Sue Heintzelman, and a special thanks to Pat Heisler for the persistent and buoyant emails in my sea of emails that ensured the journey here. I also want to thank you all for coming to lunch, dinner, talks, individual meetings. I know you're very busy. We're in the middle of 12 search candidates ourselves, so I understand how busy you all are, but I'm really honored to be here and I really appreciate the time that you've made. So this is an excerpt from a book manuscript I'm working on. I have sabbatical next year. I'm really excited to kind of get to it. But my undergraduate education, I also did cognitive science. I was an astrophysicist. I did cognitive science. So I'm kind of looping way back to some of that work. And I'm trying to think through some of these questions from a feminist science studies, critical disability perspective. And I do have access copies if anyone needs them. I'll just set them there. You can raise your hand. Maybe someone can pass them back. So in Presidential Proclamation 6158, 1990, George Bush, perhaps ironically, declared it to be the decade of the brain. The seat of human intelligence, interpreter of senses, and controller of movement, this incredible organ continues to intrigue scientists and laymen alike. Over the years, our understanding of the brain, how it works, what goes wrong when it's injured or diseased, has increased dramatically, he says. However, we still have much more to learn. The need for continued study of the brain is compelling. Millions of Americans are affected each year by disorders of the brain, ranging from neurogenetic diseases to the degenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's, as well as stroke, schizophrenia, autism, and impairments of speech, language, and hearing. End quote. So at the turn of the millennium, I would say the brain has become increasingly the prominent organ of selfhood, as well as futurity and profitability. This emphasis reflects the shift from psychology and psychiatry to cognitive and neuroscience in defining the mind and therefore the self within scientific knowledge. And with the emergence and rise of the brain sciences, cognitive science and neuroscience, neuroknowledges are transforming how we identify, understand, and manage personhood, humanness, and capacities. The declaration in this case by the state conveys, I think, the neurocentrism of our era, possibly, the belief and practice of seeing the brain as foundational to, in the words of Victoria Pitts Taylor, the many aspects of human nature and social life, and where the ability to know the key truths about the self and the social are increasingly dependent on developments in neuroscience. So Obama, not to be left behind, had his own grand challenging brain initiative. So while big science encompasses large projects like the Human Genome Project, the Large Hadron Collider, two of the largest initiatives in big science today are President Obama's BRAIN initiative, Brain Research through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, about $300 million, and the European Human Brain Project, which is about $1.6 billion. So funding for big science often relies on larger and larger claims linked to profound and profitable discoveries. Here both initiatives rhetorically vow to reach new horizons, chart new frontiers, and take giant leaps in conjunction with progress narratives of modernity. And as an aside, I'll say universities do this too with their grand challenges, and they replicate very much the same kinds of claims about solving social problems, and that's another conversation, but I think it's very interestingly linked. Big science not only promises a place in the global future for America, but one in which neuro-big science provides the basis for the extraction and production of a new form of biocapital. We can't afford to miss these opportunities, Obama says, while the rest of the world races ahead. We have to seize them. I don't want the next job-creating discoveries to happen in China or India or Germany. I want it to happen right here in the United States of America. So if neural citizenship projects in the late era of late capital and war are moving from discovering the self to locating neural knowledge within capitalism and war, the initiative identifies the state's investments in neural citizenship projects focused on bioeconomic insecurities, global political economies of techno-labor, the threat of the Asian other, and the outcomes of trauma and injury due to war. Here, neural knowledge is articulated through and embedded within ableist state projects and biocapitalism. Pathologized brains, Alzheimer's, autism, etc., are seen as potential burdens upon the state, but are also imbued with bio-value and engines of biocapitalism. Neural knowledge is seen as necessary to breaking down and molecularizing populations into parts and identifying as potential targets of neural citizenship projects that are produced through big science collaborations between state-funded academia and corporations. So these initiatives are seen as necessary to managing neural risk within the nation. And in my larger project, I have an early chapter that delineates the kind of varied manifestations of anti-autism stigma. And specifically, I outline how stigma, how autism and neurodivergence, and I'll talk about that term in a while, more broadly have been imagined as national threats to security and health of the American nation and its citizenry. Autism has been framed as an epidemic, as toxic injury, as economic burden, as the result of maternal failure to manage neoliberal neural risk, and the cause of violence. And in fact, a campaign in 2007, neurodivergence is treated as a threat to familial and national security, thereby making failure to manage the risk of autism as a failure of neural nationalism. There's no doubt that autism's target is infigured as a young white boy, the vulnerable and injured proto-citizen in need of protection and security. A campaign by the New York University Child Study Center used hostage notes and threats of terror and criminality in their campaign against autism and other forms of neural difference. And you can see in this case, it says, "We're in possession of your son. We're making him squirm and fidget until he's a detriment to himself and those around him. Ignore this and your kid will pay. ADHD. We have your son. We're destroying his ability for social interaction and driving him into a life of complete isolation. It's up to you now." Asperger's syndrome. And then 12 million kids are held hostage by a psychiatric disorder. "We have your son," in a little box. "We will make sure he will not be able to care for himself or interact socially as long as he lives. This is only the beginning. Autism." So in these notes, not only, and other people have written about it, but I don't think they've tied these questions to kind of bio-neural insecurities and the way in which the state is operating around these, especially in a post-9/11 context, and the increasing thinking around securitization of borders around bio-insecurity as well. And the new NYU campaign provokes an anxiety around neural threats as a form of neuronationalism, with autism and other kinds of difference in the foreground. So in this way, the real threat is not only geopolitical, but biological and biopolitical. And I would say the target for these are mothers, right? And so it's a different kind of gendering as well in thinking about security. But I want to argue that there's another need to think through debility and capacity to address the kind of biopolitical and necropolitical formations of neurality as well. In the works of scholars such as Julie Livingston and Jasper Puar, debility encompasses a broad range of illness, injury, states of being that people experience historically in geopolitically different ways. Simply put, the experience of people identified or identifying as disabled doesn't always align with those who experience physical, psychological, affective debility, illness, trauma, or injury. All of us are experiencing morality of neural citizenship, and in that way, kind of neoliberal relations, neoliberalized relations are happening through this idea of capacity and debility. And I think the ways we want to think through the way they're playing out here, not necessarily just to individual bodies, but rather they draw attention to what bodies do, how populations are managed, capacities to act are mobilized, and that we're not so, I'm not so much interested in drawing these lines between able and disabled, but also thinking about how they play out in neural citizenship. And we can see that neurocapitalism mobilizes both debility and capacity for potential profit. So when we're looking at the BRAIN initiative, in the ways in which it sees both, reduced language barriers through technological advances and how computers interface, that this is an example of trying to activate a capacity through neurotechnologies. But there's also, the sense of trauma due to war, right, and identifying certain populations that need to be recuperated or rehabilitated, but become increasingly drawn into these spaces within kind of neural neoliberalism. So if neural citizenship, so we can see neurocapitalism mobilizing both stability and capacity for potential profit. I'd also add that biocapitalism and neurocapitalism are neoliberal, and they pursue both kind of a ramps and cures aspect. It's not that they're just interested in curing. Accessibility treatment is as much profitable, if not more so, in certain cases. So there isn't that tension necessarily of either or. I think it seeks to create capacity around both. If Nicholas Rose and Carlos Nova suggest that a new kind of citizenship, biological citizenship, takes place through biomedicine, genomics, and biotechnology, and describes the way that state power and biological knowledge identify, mark, and act upon individuals as part of population, Rose goes on to say that biological citizenship is both individualizing and collectivizing. Biological images, explanations, values, and judgments thus get entangled with other languages of self, descriptions, and other criteria of self-judgment within a more general contemporary regime of the self, as a prudent yet enterprising individual actively shaping his or her life course through acts of choice. And I want to think about neural citizenship very much the same. And when you think about the popular conceptions of neural citizenship, and what I'm going to talk about is like neural self-governance, you're supposed to do crossword puzzles to improve your neural capacity. And if you don't, you're being a bad neural citizen because you might become a burden because you'll get Alzheimer's, right? So you're just like your Fitbit, you're supposed to be very much managing your neural self as well. So I propose that neural citizenship refers to specific citizenship projects that link neuroscientific knowledge, biopolitics, and governmentality. More specifically, neural citizenship projects identify and manage individuals within populations by defining conditions and disorders through popular discourses, governance, and governmentality, as well as scientific research about the brain. I use neural citizenship, like biological citizenship, to refer to projects linking neural knowledges that defines what it means to be a neurologically normal to conceptions of citizenship, but also at the same time enact capacity and ability in different ways in terms of the racial and imperial state within the capital. And if neural citizenship is enlivened by neurocapitalism and disciplinary mechanisms of governmentality, and also say that citizenship continues to be an internal and external system of sorting, distributing, and assigning rights and resources, and social value that's also violently dehumanizing. So part of what I'm going to try to think through is how is it that neural citizenship projects play out in ways that we don't even think about it. So how is lead poisoning, for example, part of this, and how is it that it distributes vulnerability and precarity across life chances, right? And so we're gonna get to Black Lives Matter at the end here. But if we think about the ways that the devaluing of human lives seems commonsensical, logical, and even unnecessary, that now neural citizenship projects identify which citizen brains should be cultivated to let live and how. While all citizens must manage their brains and themselves, certain brains, soldiers with PTSD, elderly with Alzheimer's, athletes with concussions, children in poverty, and children with autism, for example, are identified and targeted for biopolitical rehabilitation and recuperation, and all very in differentiated ways. So if social responsibilities are transformed into individual risks and personal deficiencies that indicate the moral failure of individuals who do not mind neoliberal common sense, neural governmentality places responsibilities for familial neural management, optimization, and health within the domain of the family, and specifically motherhood. Part of the book, Chapter 2, looks at mothers as entrepreneurial agents of choice, consumption, and risk management in relation to autism. And it sees mothers as responsible, and looks at how mothers are responsible for production of normative, non-dependent, productive economic citizens within biocapitalist regimes. And we can think even of the CDC recommendations recently that sexually active women not on birth control should eschew alcohol as pre-pregnant women, or the Salvadorian state urging women to avoid pregnancy until 2018 due to the potential of microcephaly. Resulting from the Zika virus, for example, as women who are asked to manage their vital capacities through neural governance, right? Like, because it's really about the neurality of the fetus that's at stake there. But they're the risk managers. Women and children are seen as responsible for managing possible accrued benefits or risk and harm to the unborn child citizen while ensuring the greatest possible accrued benefits for taking particular risks. And they must be entrepreneurial and assess the costs and benefits of choosing certain options or taking certain risks, especially for those related to birth, health, environment, education, and consumption. And narratives of neuroplasticity and brain plasticity, right, are very critical to that. It's a critical age, right? Like, so this idea of flexibility also plays with neuroflexibility is also part of, I think, neoliberalism in that way, that there's constant ability to change. But they become the central tropes of neoliberal neural governance. So if all citizens are responsible for better neural government and must learn how to do so within the heteronormative family, and then there are companies that are starting, sorry I missed this one, that are talking about neural capital, right, and how is it that neuroplasticity can lead to more profit, capitalizing on psychological capital, social capital, and so on. So if all citizens are responsible for better neural governmentality and must learn how to do so within the heteronormative family, one example we can look at is Pixar's 2015 film Inside Out. I don't get to go to many films often because I have children, but this one I saw. So it was at home. So Inside Out, an animated film set primarily in the brain of a young girl, the much lauded film was recognized for its neuroscientific accuracy in rendering brain function, cognition, and emotion. More importantly, it demonstrated the techniques of the self necessary for creating and maintaining an affectively balanced neural self. The film is ostensibly about neural self-governance and proper balanced affectively, sensorily, and cognitive young girl child. And the importance common sense that's the goal of neural self-governance is an affective balance that's achieved between happy and sad within the context of the heteronormative family. And the fact that it's a young girl, I think, is very critical because then she's going to become the mother, the one who's actually attuned already to the balance. But the father isn't, he's busy thinking about sports, right? But the mother's attuned to the right kind of balance and so on. And I can't remember if I told this later, but I have a chapter also where I look at motherhood in relation to autism, and I'll come back and talk a little bit about this. So within neurocapitalism and neural citizenship, autism has a significant role. And for the sake of this presentation, I'm defining autism as a constellation of symptoms and traits that's constantly changing, a materialization of the body, mind, and behaviors that emerges and has meaning only through and between subjects. Autism has emerged as a way of knowing and categorizing people with the rise of psychiatry, but is now the object of research in multiple disciplines, including psychology, medicine, education, and neuroscience. But I've recently been thinking of autism through the formation of the autism industrial complex, and you'll have to humor me here and see what you think of this. Resembling President Eisenhower's coinage of the term military industrial complex in 1961 during his farewell speech. Eisenhower was warning about the power of the conjoined forces of government and industries dedicated to weapons and war. But beyond these two components, there were other attendant contributors, including people in military towns and bases, academia and think tanks, nonprofits, and related businesses. The autism industrial complex is a confluence of interests between the state, capital, science, and other institutions such as family, medicine, prisons, schools, and clinics. The rise of autism-related research, therapies, services, products, drugs, diagnostic tests, treatments, literature, and culture has exponentially expanded in the last 3 decades. The autism industrial complex involves a set of bureaucratic, political, and economic interests that encourage increased spending on autism scientific research, rehabilitation, pharmaceuticals, towards usually the purpose of cure and normalization, but also for the case of management of difference. And we can talk about that. In thinking about the autism industrial complex, there are many people who are tied to its existence, its management or lack thereof, and its proliferation. We can certainly think about how it's related to the medical industrial complex, and certainly with the school-to-prison pipeline to the prison industrial complex, I would argue. It's an increasingly globalist phenomenon, so the end part of the book tries to really think through what does the globalization of autism mean. And I do so partly looking at a film like My Name is Khan, a popular Hindi film, as well as kind of thinking about how autism travels and how to understand that even through academic research. So I want to suggest that autism creates a looping effect by which more autistic people are produced. Ian Hacking offers the idea of looping, which suggests that the classification categories used to define people in populations, in this case autistic people, transform not only the categories but the populations that are being described. Once we label people as having autism, they're understood to be and become autistic. They in turn transform the category of autism that remakes people. And again, I'm not denying the materiality of the body-brain, but I want to suggest the autism industrial complex is one mechanism fostering looping. And that the complex not only makes autistic people, but it also makes attendant figures, therapists, and in the case, what I'm interested in looking at is like parents and especially mothers, as well as scientists and even figures of shooters. So I have a section where I look at the figure of the autistic shooter as well. So part of what my project looks at are the figures that are produced by this. So chapter 1 delineates the varied manifestations of anti-autism stigma. I talk about the national threat, insecurity, and so on. But I also talk about the ways in which autism is a common explanation and along with a risk for things like mass gun violence. And I attend to particular figures that arise to embody this threat, namely the figures like the autistic school shooter for cases of violence at Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Aurora Islaviste. And for Asian Americanists, this is where I also look at the entanglement of Asian Americanist racialized political affect and autism. Many of those are actually places where at least two of those shootings are, we could call them Asian American, and the ways in which autism configures into, and is both erased, their Asian American is both explained as part of their violence, but also erased. In chapter 2, identify specific figures within neoliberal motherhood, including the immunity mom, which is the vaccine-hesitant mom who's avoiding toxic injury, managing risk, the warrior mother, the one who's rescuing the child citizen, and the failed mother, the one who blogs about her failure as a mother, and how failure is a narrative within, and failed white womanhood is a narrative within neoliberal citizenship that's particularly powerful in that way. So the second half of the book, I move from figures to thinking autism within the context of race and necropolitics, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So if disability movements have long contested biological citizenship, seeking inclusion, acceptance, and accommodations, disability rights and autistic advocates have long engaged and contested normalizing neural citizenship by deploying neural knowledge to redefine neural conditions of being, such as autism, articulating neural subjectivities different from the medical formations, and advocating for civil rights based on neural difference. Autistic people also contest the terms of neural citizenship by seeking inclusion, by deploying neural knowledge to redefine autism. So some of them, for example, one theory that's very popular is that people with autism or autistics don't have theory of mind. And they challenge this very strongly, that this is not how we experience autism, we don't lack theory of mind. They move from a deficit model and kind of reshift the categories of knowing. And that they also, activists, educators, and scholars are trying to reframe autism as a set of sensory motor and neurological differences rather than a disorder. So that there is a way in which they're just shifting the meaning of saying it's not a disorder, it's a form of difference. And why neurodiversity itself has become such a popular way of thinking about this. The neurodiversity movement challenges the barriers that limit the participation of autistic society by arguing for citizenship rights through self-advocacy and acceptance in place of rehabilitation, institutionalization, and normalization. Aligning itself with other civil rights-based social movements, neurodiversity movement, composed of autistic adults and allies, claim an autistic identity, and not just autistic, but all kinds of neural difference, claim an autistic identity and thereby argue that autism forms the basis for neurocultural community and is a valuable form of human diversity. And in that way, I'm very interested in what claims they make through this kind of access to citizenship through civil rights. In 1999, autistic sociologist Judith Singer coined the term neurodiversity to define autism not as a set of deficits, disorders, and impairment, but as a neural difference. She argues, quote, that the neurologically different represent a new addition to the familiar political categories of class, gender, race. In its broadest conceptions, neurodiversity paradigm frames the whole of human mental or psychological neurological structures or behaviors not as problematic, but as alternate acceptable forms of human biology. Referring to other terms such as biodiversity and cultural diversity, neurodiversity thought asserts difference and variation as natural and therefore worthy and valuable. So you can kind of see where that can also be very problematic. I just had my students write about why Lady Gaga is born this way might not be the basis for our queer politics, right? So thinking about denaturalizing this might be really productive as well. Proponents of neurodiversity frequently advocate for anti-normalization, often emphasizing the recognition of different neurological modes of being as part of the range of human variations. Variations that be seen as acceptable and viewed with value. And neurodiversity includes a wide range of neural differences such as autism, bipolar disorder, ADHD, Tourette's, dyslexia, and often neurodiversity movements align with and often include like mad pride, so much broader in their conceptions as well. The term neurodiversity and also Cassian Sibley's neurodivergence have proliferated within activist scholarly and popular domains, including Special Issues of Disability Studies Quarterly, focusing on autism and the concept of neurodiversity. In addition, there are scholars like Nick Walker, Ibby Grace, Ari Naiman, Melanie Argo, Amy Sequenza, Lydia Brown, among many others that kind of re-theorize components of autistic ontology and epistemology, including challenging theory of mind, characterizations of people as high functioning and low functioning, as well as the implicit and explicit associations of the human with the verbal, right, in the way in which nonverbal marks someone as having very much a non-subject personhood. But they've also created new communities and identities such as neuroqueer. So mobilizing claims to neural citizenship, neurodivergent and allied scholars have argued for civil rights through the discourse of neurodiversity as a means for contesting abject status as citizens in need of rehabilitation and curing. The neurodiversity movement challenges the barriers that limit the participation of autistics in society by arguing for citizenship rights through advocacy and acceptance in place of institutionalization, normalization, etc. Some neurodivergent activists and educators are also seeking to reframe it as a sensory motor. So there's like the extreme theory that people with autism, autistics are actually folks who experience the world too intensely, right? That it's a kind of sensory affective experience. So in this way of mobilizing claims to neural citizenship, autistics have argued for civil rights. And they've also argued in this place in which the right to be is unaltered and natural. And in that way in which the that there's a kind of emphasis on certain kinds of projects, but it also continues to proliferate subjectivity. So more and more people are included into this as part of the looping effect that I was talking about. And if the neurodiversity advocates deploy and shape neural knowledge and constantly make moral, political, and scientific claims individually and collectively, their claims have kind of focused, the sites of their disability justice have been things like naming neuronormativity, so even coining a term like the equivalent of cisgender for people who are not neurodivergent. Allistic is one for non-autistic, but there's also neurotypical, right? So naming the norm. Shifting from a deficit model to an asset-based model, prioritizing needs and within the autism industrial complex. So taking away, there was a international meeting for autism research where Temple Grandin was given an award and said, you need to stop studying eye contact and you need to focus on sensory issues, for example. Not that it happened, but that was at least one of the kind of suggestions and kind of charges. There's also a call for disrupting rehabilitation practice that normalize, such as advocacy for flapping and stimming. So saying, don't make us look normal, let us do what we need to do to feel good. Naming violence against neurodivergent people within institutions of medicine, education, and especially the family, but coming out against restraints, electroshock therapies, bullying, and murder, especially by family members. And then shifting representational practices from emphasis on children to those of adults. And this kind of focus on family and hillside leaves intact questions, though, of other forms of violence, especially state violence, and larger biopolitical formations in neurocapitalism. And I want to think about how we might want to ask different questions. So for those of us in feminist, queer, critical ethnic studies who've long critiqued diversity and its location within neoliberalism, what are the limits of such a disability justice moment configured through this articulation of neurodiversity? In other words, how might we extend our critique of diversity inclusion within neoliberalism and neurocapitalism? How might we need to question the location of neurodiversity within neoliberalism and often a very white disability studies movement to actually articulate racial biopolitics? And at its heart, neurodiversity paradigms negotiate the biopolitical through an emphasis on the non-normative. But again, in this case, I think that doesn't kind of cut it, right? That diversity is more productive, verdant than normativity, some would argue. That diverse is better than is the new normal. So if diversity, as critical race and queer scholars have argued, is a mechanism for the management of difference, I think we are seeing the sopping up of autistic vital capacities, in Nefertiti's language, and seeing new forms of extraction that are built within new structures on top of old ones. Autistic difference is seen as possibly productive within flexible neoliberal economies that can value a wide range of labors. So what I'm talking about here is that in the kind of like older narratives of autistics being institutionalized, autistic people needing to be rehabilitated, there's kind of the more accepting narrative that we're getting, that they're exceptional, that they're productive economic citizens within techno-economies. In fact, they might be the ideal techno-citizens. Alan Turing, Steve Jobs, Wired, Bill Gates, the girl who kicks things, Mr. Robot, right? These are all kinds of formations of the exceptional autistic figure who is the ideal techno-citizen. These figures suggest that it's possible to put autistic vital capacities at work for employers and for capitalism. They configure the autistic techno-citizen as having a useful, if not ideal, capacity within techno-futurities of neurocapitalism. In his book Neurotribe, Steve Silberman writes, in the past 40 years, some members of this tribe have migrated from the margins of society to the mainstream. The kids formerly ridiculed as nerds and brainiacs have become the architects of our future. We can see this as a shift from the more familiar normalization and regulatory forms of disciplinary power to that of capacitation of neurally different bodies and minds. So if disability studies frameworks have assisted in reclaiming historical figures such as Alan Turing in order to imagine inclusion into social, political, and economic worlds, and do you know what I'm talking about when I talk about Alan Turing and the kind of narrative of both queer and autistic as being not just the inventor of the computer, but in some ways anticipating the kind of techno-future and the kind of embodying that as a figure. These narratives then help imagine future-oriented speculation about the bio-value of neural difference as human capital, at the same time provoking anxiety about the risk of social and economic dependence of neurally divergent people. The potentiality for profit is imagined within the capacitation of debility while lauding social and political progress through diversity and biological citizenship. Hence, while normalization continues to be the primary focus for some, we may want to pay attention to the broader implications and reach of neural citizenship and neurocapitalism. Kelly Fritsch similarly comments that, quote, given biopolitical developments in neoliberal biocapitalism, a shift has occurred such that the focus is more on the differential capacitation of bodies rather than their normalization. That is, through capacitating processes like genetic therapies, surgeries, supplements, prosthetic enhancements, and healthism, bodies are to be capacitated and enhanced beyond what is thought of as able-bodied. And yet bodies are neither entirely capacitated nor debilitated. There are gradations of debility and capacity, end quote. So I suggest that it's necessary that we forge a disability politics that encompasses conceptions of capacity and debility with our contemporary social, economic, and political worlds. Similarly, I want to move from neurodiversity movement further into conversation with critical race feminist politics. I want to bring the multiple political and epistemological commitments with me to produce a coalitional framework. If we're to think and take our commitments to queer, feminist, critical race, and decolonial possibilities seriously, we need to bring them together to reframe the social and political within neurocapitalism and neural citizenship. So race and debility and why we need to talk about Freddie Gray, school to prison pipeline in Flint, Michigan. Typically, discussions about race, autism, and neurodivergence focus on the underreporting of African Americans and Latinos who may be on the spectrum. And I go to these conferences and I go to these events, they're always thinking about how do we get that number up to the white number, right? How do we know they're underrepresented. We need to include them as an expansion of the autism industrial complex that seeks to include. We may want to think differently about this question. Disability justice activists, and then I don't discount the fact that people need access to therapies, people need access to resources, and the way to do that, again, is this looping. You have to become pathologized and medicalized and then get access, right? This is the kind of way it works. Disability justice activists have long emphasized the violence of bullying and the murder of disabled people by their own family members, but many call upon the state for redress, for harsher bullying policies, for the criminal legal system to incarcerate those committing violence. And I want to address more broadly other forms of violence and harm, such as state violence, social death, and the neglect that accompany the mechanisms of citizenship. I want to turn to a few stories now. In 2014, 11-year-old Black and autistic young boy, Caleb Moon Robinson, kicked a trash can in his school and later walked out of the class without permission and was wrestled to the floor and arrested and charged, and the police officer charged Moon Robinson with a felony. The Center for, and this is the more popular image that is circulated of him, and I really prefer this one, which shows him in a familial context with a lot of affective social engagement, right, with his family, and not isolated and not, again, like the perspective here, which was the more popular one, wearing the hoodie in a very particular way, which was signaling, of course, a discourse and a visual iconography that we need to be aware of, and I think it's mobilizing. But at the same time, I think, again, making him look older, right, removing the innocence from Black young boys, which is what so happens so often. I like this image of him better. The Center for Public Integrity analyzed Department of Education data to reveal that the Virginia schools, in which Moon Robinson was attending one, in a single year referred students to law enforcement agencies at a rate nearly 3 times the national rate. Virginia's referral rate, about 16 for every 1,000 students, compares to the national rate of 6 referrals for every 1,000. In Virginia, some of the individual schools with the highest rates of referral, in one case 228 per 1,000 students, were middle schools, whose students were from 11 to 14 years old. I also want to note, obviously, too, that there's a high correspondence between Black and Hispanic boys and disabled boys, where in these correlations as well, and which ones are being school to prison pipeline. Reginald Nellie Latson was originally arrested for being suspicious for wearing a hoodie outside a library in Virginia, where he was waiting to go in to check out books. In the police encounter, Latson did not respond verbally and tried to leave, leading to an altercation with a police officer. He subsequently spent 4 years imprisoned, including a solitary confinement for his own protection. Governor Terry McAuliffe granted Latson a conditional pardon. He would be transferred to a secure treatment center located in Florida, where he can now, quote-unquote, receive the appropriate services he needs in the correct environment. In an official statement by the ACLU of Virginia, Executive Director Claire Guthrie said, "The governor did the right thing. Virginia must provide suitable community services for people with disabilities rather than using the criminal justice system to warehouse them." After the death of Freddie Gray from spinal cord injuries sustained under police custody, soon after he was killed, it was revealed that Gray had been exposed to lead poisoning and was one of the many thousands of mainly poor Black Baltimore residents who had been exposed to lead. Gray's level of lead in his blood was 3 to 4 times the amount designated as lead poisoning. How do we develop a critical race neurodivergent queer politics that recognizes the lives of Gray, Latson, and Moon Robinson? Manager of Programs and Education at Towson University's Hussman Center for Adults with Autism, Zosia Sachs, asks, why is no one discussing Freddie Gray's disabilities? Historically, disabled people have had a higher risk for ineffective interactions with law enforcement personnel. This is not to discount factors of racism at all, but disability discrimination or ableism is the most hidden ism of all in our society. It's just not dealing with it. In Freddie Gray's case, this is still her voice, racial discrimination is compounded by the disability discrimination, and when we ignore this fact, any solution to the problem of police bias and brutality will be incomplete. What does it mean is that, what this means is that people who communicate, think, and learn and emote differently must have the accommodations, supports, and guidance needed to level the playing field. This also means that civil workers in a city like Baltimore, in which hundreds of children have sustained lead poisoning, must receive training to ensure public safety for all citizens. End quote. And I think a typical response to lead poisoning and its impact on communities of color is to name the environmental racism faced by immigrants of color, indigenous, and African Americans. Another is to call for more sensitive police response. And if we want to think through capacity and ability within biopower, we want to recall that for Foucault, racism is a prerequisite for biopolitics, that make live, make die, and let die are operating in this way through capacity and ability in this case. We need to think through populations in the way that capacities and abilities are organized, aggregated, and broken into different parts and managed as targets within neural citizenship projects. So I want to think about the futures or lack thereof as configured in these stories and how young black boys and men are imagined. And clearly in the way that autism is gendered, right, women and girls hardly appear in the narratives to begin with, especially racialized narratives of girls of color, women of color. While children are held up as a sign of the future in earlier narratives, right, like the threat of the young proto-citizen imagined as white being held ransom, these young men are not. They're assumed to be criminals, burdens, or best tolerated. Cast out of reproductive futurism imagined by Lee Edelman and others, these youth, like those of Flint, Michigan, do not embody the white child of nationalist heteronormative futurity. And the background is the Time magazine, and I find it kind of problematic in the way in which it's both kind of replicating posters of children with disabilities, right? So I wanted you to be able to see the child's eyes, but I didn't want to reproduce the freakishness or the pity of the thing. So it's also imposed with images of Flint water. Anyway, so how are they evacuated outside of childhood together? This isn't the autistic child seeking a neurodiverse future. So we must attend to the ways in which neural citizenship projects acting through the school-to-prison pipeline, through incarceration, through police violence, and environmental racism operate. We must not be afraid to find, in some sense, a present vitality here. And it doesn't mean that we attend to the ways in which neural citizenship is part and parcel of the distribution hierarchies of life, death, and animacy within biopolitics. And necropolitics, and I think it imagines different neurocultures for ourselves. When we read of Flint, Michigan, and the lead contamination that's happening there, we can see how environmental racism is imagining and invoking disability. Over 2 decades ago, Flint was narrated so famously by Michael Moore as a space of working-class American abandonment, and it's now re-entering the imaginary as a site of toxic devastation. More so, it's become understood as a side of risk and liability in which African Americans primarily are increasingly framed as mentally deficient and harmed. The story of Flint becomes a moral panic about the economic and social burden of lead-poisoned neurodivergent African Americans without a futurity. And again, if we're thinking about how to do this, how, as we think about the expansion of neurocapitalism and neoliberalism, how do we not just continue to activate the ways in which things like the Brain Initiative will now include children with lead poisoning, include children with poverty, while still attending to their possibilities. So we need to imagine these bodies' environments as not already dead. In other words, it becomes necessary to develop a response to toxicity that does not discount these lives as lives without a present, without a future, lives not worth living, life without capacity. We are all vulnerable to toxicity, and it's not a failure to manage the risk. As Mel Chen poignantly remarks, toxins are not so very containable or quarantainable. They're better thought of as conditions with effects, bringing their own affects and animacies to bear on lives and non-lives. End quote. So different presents and futures that are less focused on the future economies of citizenship in their calculation, the negotiations and enactments of capacities in the everyday political. In that sense, we don't want to have to desire a future without disabilities. As Alison Kafer warns us, we don't want neural difference and disability more generally to serve as the specter of queer and disability fear and burden that motivates public response, the kind of moral panics. We want to think about life itself today and the life that is for survival. And I'm thinking here also of the ways in which, how do we recognize the labor of that fetching of water, of thinking about all the acts of survival that were going on before that and continue on after. In Flint, people create out of their own bodily capacities infrastructure to support themselves. Capitalism, Nefertiti suggests, does not have to pay attention to the social reproduction of these lives. For her, new forms of extraction are built on new structure, but we still continue to see how people make life through capacities, make lives of survival. Puar writes that we must invite the realization that bodies are lively and that realization that bodies are lively in practice responses to environments that change over time, even when those environmental changes involve exposure to carcinogens, neurotoxins, aphogens, mutagens, to possibilities of cancer, diabetes, immune system failure, and heart disease. But where danger lies, promise might also be found. I come back to care and social reproduction for those who are enacting survival, who are thinking out letting live out of letting die. I turn to two writers who think about sickness, capacity, and care. And the first is Misha Cardenas, who writes, "In a way, we're all sick, but we're also caretakers, family members, chosen and biological, and we're all there for one another, in need or to offer help. In a society that would leave each of us in isolation, we are finding ways of existing together, interdependent, however difficult it may be at times, with love." The other one is by Johanna Hedva in Sick Woman Theory. "The most anti-capitalist protest is to care for one another and to care for yourself, to take on the historically feminized and therefore invisible practice of nurturing, nursing, caring, to take seriously each other's vulnerability and fragility and precarity, and to support, honor it, empower it, to protect each other, to enact and practice community, a radical kinship, an interdependent sociality, a politics of care. Because once we are all ill and confined to the bed, sharing our stories of therapies and comforts, forming support groups, bearing witness to each other's tales of trauma, prioritizing the care and love of our sick, pained, expensive, sensitive, fantastic bodies, and there is no one left to go to work, perhaps then, finally, capitalism will screech to its much-needed, long overdue, and motherfucking glorious halt." So in turning to sick theory, I want to shift not from imagining toxicity, suffering, sickness, that means a life not worth living. Instead, I want to crip our desires and imaginings and open up to, value, and desire those worlds where survival happens, reshaping ableist neoliberal social relations where debility is not just another possibility for extraction. Instead, I hope it means continuing to recognize presence and imagine futures learned yet to desire. Thank you.